Hello everyone, it's going to be a bit of a different style video today, because as you guys know, I released my EU5 gameplay video, and I said I would do a much deeper dive into all of the stuff that's actually going on in that video, so that's what today's video is. I won't be going over literally every part of that video, so it might still be worth a watch if you're there for some of the memes, I guess. But after going through my own video, I'm going to be answering a couple of additional questions that were asked in the comments of the last video as well. So if you did ask a question in the comments, it's worth going and checking at the end of the video to see if I answered them. So to try out the game, I did play as Portugal first. You're not really under any threat as Portugal, it's pretty safe to play, so it allows you to just sit there and observe the numbers, see what works, see what doesn't. I used that as a trial run to try and figure out how to declare and fight a war, so I had a couple of tests against like Grenada and Morocco. I didn't really do much though, so the outcome was not very interesting. Then I did play as Kanin Kehaka, which is one of the tribes in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I thought maybe if I play a country that doesn't have a lot going on, I can focus on the very minute details so that I can have a better understanding of how each of the mechanics work at a core, more fundamental level. Turns out it wasn't that helpful because these guys have a very different way of playing them. There is one interesting thing though, and that is it looks a little empty in North America if you've seen the maps, but fortunately they have the societies of pops, which do, at least the version that I played, they become settled over time. So you can play as one of these. I think there are like 10 total starting countries you can play as in North America. That's outside of the general Mesoamerica area. And when you play as one of those, it looks really lonely and empty, but then like 50 years into the game, you're surrounded with a bunch of other countries. As for Greenland, many of you probably saw that I played a little bit further than this. So this is my 15-17 save. I will go a little more into that when I actually make the Greenland video, so let's not worry about that too much. Tried a little bit of Ireland, tried a very small amount of Ulm. I found them both very difficult to play, so I didn't get very far in either case. And then again with Scandinavia/Norway and Scotland/Alba, I will be following up on those in different videos. There is a little more to this between the, what are they called? Guelphs? Someone told me I pronounced it wrong. Maybe it's Guelphs. I don't know. I don't care. Between those guys and the Ghibellines, there's a little more to it that I will expand upon in a moment. But this is actually not the totality of it, as you see later on. What is interesting though is these little modifiers here, where when you're a member, you're excluded from Imperial protection, which kind of means that we can just invade anybody who's in this general group without the Emperor intervening. There are 3 options for that personal union. I actually, in hindsight, I don't really know if it's best to go with low. I went with low to start with because I felt like I wanted to save myself some money to spend on like expanding the economy and then preparing for the Black Death. So that was the idea behind that. Whether or not that really would have had that much of an impact, I'm not sure, because I don't think that the high union contribution is actually that high either. I don't end up focusing on it, but it is there on the right side. If I zoom in over here, we have alchemy, which gives you the character life expectancy, and the plague resistance is plus 5%. Super useful to grab that. Fortunately, we do start with it, but not every country does. So why these options? Well, literacy from the clergy is going to be one of your main sources of literacy on top of literacy for the burghers. So that explains the first pick and the third pick. The second pick is institution growth, which is important because we're about to get the Renaissance. Institutions spread kind of like how they do in EU4, so they go from like one province to the next. I don't know all of what influences the growth and spread of institutions, but my thinking was, okay, if I get institution growth, then I can either adopt those new institutions earlier, or I can adopt them at the same time I normally would, but for cheaper, because it will have spread a lot faster. And that's pretty useful because when you start the game off, you have a lot of, I think it's the tradition society value, which makes it so that you have like a plus 200% cost to embracing institutions. And that's particularly bad because it costs a lot of stability. It also costs some money, but stability is the thing that takes longer to acquire. Now, literacy is also important because, as I mentioned later, it affects your research speed. So if you get higher maximum literacy, then that increases your maximum research speed. Obviously, that's just inherently important for pretty much any strategy game that has technology. Afterwards, I pick up the stability stability investment, because I know that when the Black Death hits, you need to spend a lot of stability on those actions. So like isolating the economy, isolating the cities, expelling the sick, all of that costs stability. So I'm hoping that by going down this research, if I can get it fast enough, then I can stockpile more stability to use when the Black Death hits. Then I eventually go over here to the trade capacity. I actually should have gone with this maybe first, because trade is really, really important right now. It can easily become your main source of income, as you do see later on. Now, if I remember correctly, I actually do end up changing these a little bit later on. I think I still complete these first three, but I don't think I continue down this path, and instead I think I go down food production, because I then realize just how bad the food situation is in Italy, which is pretty bad. It's kind of true that you do want as many levies as possible in the early game if you're planning to go to war. However, in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have gone with everyone and instead gone with the top option, because then I don't have the estate penalty for happiness and or whatever equilibrium, right? Turns out I don't need that additional levy size because we already have a sizable population, and because we end up transitioning to having a very strong and professional army relatively early into the game, that was maybe not the greatest decision. Like, you can see that we do get the additional army and navy levy size, like the plus 5%, which is something, but when you compare it to losing the satisfaction equilibrium with these estates, it's really not worth it in my opinion. In fact, I wouldn't even be opposed to like swapping it to maybe something up here, or maybe one of these ones, because frankly, like, we just don't need that many levies at this point in the game. And then when I do get my professional army, I don't end up doing this, but I should have gone down to this one, because at that point, we're not really using levies at all. The navy and both the army end up becoming professional. When we compare these options for the employment system, I think a lot of these are just roleplay. I think the equality and first come first serve are there as options in case you want them, but of course we're in the business of making money, and so most profitable is the one I think most players are going to gravitate towards, because yeah, it does just give you the most money. That's the point. You know, it does actually employ people based on how much money they're going to make. It does also give you that progress towards a capital economy, and if I'm remembering correctly, that dichotomy between capital and traditional economy is between rural and building-based output. So when you have a traditional economy, your RGOs, or your resource gathering operations, the stuff that you get from your population working the actual tiles, will have a little bit of a production boost. And when you have a capital economy, your buildings will actually receive a production boost instead. So over the course of the game, as you industrialize, or as you start to manufacture more than you produce, it ends up becoming better to have a capital economy because you just get more out of it at that point. So slowly over time, you do want to encourage your country to sort of drift in that general direction. But even despite all these bonuses, there is one slight downside. And that is, if you have a bunch of buildings that you want to have employed, and some of them make money and some of them don't, like some of them are, for example, marketplaces don't actually make money. Like the employment in the marketplaces is not what makes money. It's using the trade capacity that it gives you. That's what makes you money. So technically, if you have a shortage of burghers, for example, of people who can become merchants, then you might find that they end up being allocated towards industries that actually make money directly, rather than some of the other things that you might still need them to be employed in, but they're just not going to move towards those buildings because they don't technically make money. So there are some instances where this could be a downside, but most of the time you're going to end up in a situation where you just need to increase your qualifications, or that's what they call it in Victoria 3. Your promotion speed is basically what you need to change for that to work out. If you don't have enough burghers, then you just need to have increased promotion speed. Although I've personally not really had much of a problem with this. If you're wondering, the equality employment system, I think, employs every building with an equal number of pops. And for this one, the first come first serve is whenever you build a building, it will try to fill all of the employment for that building before it tries to fill the next one. Again, if you have enough promotion speed, none of these really end up affecting anything. So at that point, it's just like, oh, what do you want to drift towards? So these crown reforms are the ones that you decide that are mainly beneficial to the country itself. Some of them work in ways that are genuinely gameplay defining. So, for example, the harbor administration requires that you focus heavily on naval, but when you get that harbor administration, let's see if I can actually go back and look at that. It is down here, but I can't quite see it. There we go. It's a little hard to see because I am watching my own video, but down here it has the distance cost to capital through port, right down here. And then down here it also gives you monthly development gain, which is also super important. So some of these can actually be entirely gameplay defining. The distance cost to capital through port is one of the most useful things you can have when you're playing Norway, for example. It increases your proximity, which increases both your control and market access, if I remember correctly. It just so happens that in this case I chose some of the ones that were kind of boring. So autocracy is really nothing too big. It gives us additional crown power, which is good. That gives us a little bit more leeway to hand things out to the estates before we have a problem. And then agricultural cultivation just for the food production, incredibly important because, again, we're playing in Italy. Yeah, so the nobility you can see have 47%. That's a lot of power. One of the main issues with your estates having a lot of power is that it decreases the amount that you can tax them. That's a little bit of a problem, right? So because the nobility it starts at 25%. So if the estates have more than 25% power, then it reduces the amount that you can actually tax out of them. The power that they have comes from a couple of things. So for example, you can just see that there are a lot of nobles. This qualifies as a significant number of nobles. I don't actually remember why we have so many nobles. It might be from having a high serfdom value. I don't quite remember. But there's this base power that they have, and then there are these which modify that power. So each of these privileges increases by like, say 25%, or I think this one is 25%. Sometimes it's like 50, sometimes it's 100 too. And sometimes the privileges are incredibly crippling. Now, Naples doesn't start with anything that's horrible. It's preferable to get rid of this one because it's not that great. I think that one just increases your decentralization in exchange for giving you a little bit of a lower fort maintenance, and it doesn't even give the nobility any kind of equilibrium, so it doesn't increase their satisfaction either. I might end up getting rid of that one later on, I don't remember. The other thing is that the more power your estates have, relative to your own crown power, the worse issues you will suffer as well. Crown power also works from the 25% scale, so if you have below 25%, you start having somewhat significant penalties that end up getting worse and worse the less crown power you have. It's the opposite actually when you have higher than 25% crown power. In fact, the more crown power you have, the easier it becomes to revoke privileges. So you want to be a little bit careful. You don't want to hand out too much to the estates, especially ones that are already very influential. But later on, there are also buildings that can help you increase your crown power, because the baseline of this power is from pops in locations, and like certain buildings in locations. And that provides a baseline, which means some buildings you can build to actually increase your own crown power. This is fine for the clergy. It's a very small amount of equilibrium, but also a very small amount of actual power. It really just improves the relations between you and the papal states, so like not super relevant. I also hand out this privilege to the clergy. It does give them 33% more power, but it increases your tolerance to the true faith, and most importantly, increases your progress towards centralization. I find centralization is one of the things that you should start working on at the beginning of the game, because it's incredibly powerful. Decentralization, I think, makes your estates a little bit happier, and that's kind of it for the most part. That's the main benefit. But when you centralize, I think it reduces the distance cost to capital or something, which increases your proximity, increases your control. Therefore, you can increase the amount of taxes you receive, increase the market access of your locations. So when you centralize, your estates will be a little bit unhappier compared to the start, but the benefits far outweigh that. The reason why the burghers aren't that big of an issue is because, as we can see, they already don't have that much power, and so because these are modifiers you apply on top of the power that they have, this little baseline, it's really not a huge deal. Even if I double the power they have, their relative power to the other estates we have is really not that big. The nobility are the ones we have to worry about, which is why I didn't give them anything. The burghers, absolutely no problem, and the privileges you can give to the burghers are incredible. incredibly useful. I give them this for the building cost reduction. We also get monthly progress towards plutocracy. And if I'm remembering correctly, plutocracy, I think, increases the happiness of the burghers or something. It does also increase their power, and I might be misremembering this, but it might increase the rate of job change, or whatever that's called. The pop promotion rate. I give them the trade center sponsorship because we have our own market, and so increasing your market attraction means that you're going to be more competitive fighting over locations to bring into your market. You want to have more locations in your market, at least I think so. I haven't gone that deep into the economic side of things. I saw some people mention maybe you want to have additional markets within your country so that you can, I don't know, have more official price exchanges or something. I don't quite remember why, but I think people are still trying to figure out exactly what the best strategy for markets would be. From my perspective, I want to have a large market so that I have a large amount of influence over other countries, so that when they build something, they build it to benefit me. And then when I integrate that territory, when I expand territorially into my own market, those locations are already primed to work within my economy. Also, having more locations in your market kind of allows you to be more efficient with the trade capacity that you have in your market, because you don't have to trade for the stuff that's in those locations that are newly added to your market. Instead, you can trade more efficiently for other things, even if that effect is a little bit marginal. And then I handed this out to the burghers, the building roads rights. Again, not a huge power spike for them. It does give them 5% equilibrium. The main reason was for the centralization and also to allow them to build roads, but I'm gonna be honest, I've never seen them do it. I've never seen the burghers actually build roads. So I don't know if it's just because the roads are really expensive and the burghers don't want to spend their money on them. That could be, but the centralization effect is still super useful. As I mentioned, we do want to allow the commoners to migrate, mostly so that we can reconcentrate population back into these cities later on. We do get monthly progress towards free subjects as well. It's kind of hard to see down at the bottom here, but that counteracts the monthly serfdom that we're getting from some of the privileges that I've already handed out. And the other thing about allowing peasants and laborers to migrate is, I'm not quite sure if this is true, but I have a bit of a theory. There's this building called a settlement, and a settlement in the game allows you to increase your population growth by a flat 1%. And it's additional, and it's for that one location that it's built in. And so because a lot of locations have like a 0.4% monthly population growth rate, you could increase that to like 1.4%, which is pretty substantial. But the thing is, if the population in that location exceeds 5% of the maximum population for that location, then the settlements get destroyed. So that building only functions as long as you have low population fractions in those locations. So I'm thinking by centralizing the population, hopefully I can reduce the population of the rural settlements so that I can build actual settlement buildings and increase the population growth rate in those areas. Does it end up working out? No. But that was a theory that I had at the time and I thought it would work out. And I'm not sure if there are upgraded versions of settlements. Like, I don't know, maybe there are townships later on. I don't know for sure. But the idea that there could be an improved version of a settlement that maybe has a cap at 10%, maybe it's worth trying to concentrate the population. We end up handing out militias of commoners as well. In hindsight, I don't think we really need the additional peasants, but it does, as you can see here, give us another additional benefit, which is incredibly useful, the levy combat efficiency, 25%. Very effective. Because the first couple of wars we fight are fought with levies, this is super useful. Now, for peasants allowed weapons, I don't really know what this means. I think there's a chance that it allows rebellions to be more effective against you, but other than that, I know for sure that it allows you to sell weaponry to the population, which means that the population will have an additional demand for weaponry. So you can kind of create a domestic arms manufacturing industry for your own population's consumption, which gives you a little bit of a basis to expand off of when you actually need more weapons. Like, the peasants can go without their weapons if you need them for the army, essentially. That's what I'm getting at. The interesting thing about minting is that it doesn't just increase your inflation as we see here, which, by the way, it's not a very large amount. It's pretty safe to keep it at around this level. But on top of that, it also increases the demand for gold and silver. Now, we don't produce any gold and silver at the start of the game, but we can import it as a high-value trade good. So the more you mint, the more gold you can import, and the more money you actually make off of also importing those metals, silver and gold. Strengthening the government at this point because, oh, hold on, it's kind of hard to see, but up here we can see we have really, really low legitimacy, kind of a problem, so I'm hoping that by strengthening the government we can fix that as soon as possible. Also because it kind of costs money to boost up either your stability over here or your legitimacy. You have to spend money doing that. So if I can get my cabinet to do a little bit of that for me, I can spend less money, or I can resolve the problem faster. Either way, in the long run, it does save me more money that I can spend on reinvesting back into the economy. Or at least that was the thought. As for actually picking somebody, you can see that their different attributes actually do affect what they do. So one of the reasons I'm fine with picking this guy is because he's not an excellent general. He's okay as a general, right? Because each of these stats matter as a general as well. All of them, not just your military ability, all of them matter. Which means if we're going to have a general, I'm probably going to pick this guy at the top or this guy over here, because they have a little bit more of a balance to them. So even though they do have higher military stats, they would be more effective for this job. I want to reserve them to use in the army, whereas this guy, he just has admin or mill, which means I can swap him between two useful tasks roughly, or two useful categories of tasks. One of the reasons I wanted to drift towards communalism at the start of the game is because when you have high communalism, it makes it easier to revoke privileges from your estates. Essentially, it acts as a counterbalance to having low crown power at the start of the game. Whereas when you have low crown power, it makes it more expensive to take privileges away. When you have communalism, it counteracts that. It makes it cheaper to take those privileges away. And so because the nobility start with things that I don't want them to have, I decide, okay, we're going to go communalism, then I'm going to revoke stuff from the nobility, and then hopefully later on I can just drift away from communalism back to individualism. I don't remember why, but in my head, I have that association that individualism is better. I don't remember what stat exactly it is that informs that opinion, but it is one of them, I'm pretty sure. But communalism and individualism sort of just have their uses. I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other in general. The automation tab, genuinely one of my favorite parts of this game. The automation tab over here, we have Conqueror, Explorer, Trader, and Gardener. Those are the 4 archetypes of the gameplay mechanics. Essentially, Conqueror is, as you'd expect pretty much, it's just hiring armies and hiring ships and stuff. It doesn't actually fully automate your army. That point is kind of important to note. Explorer is for automating stuff like your exploration and colonization, I believe. Trader, we can see over here, this is the balance, it's a little bit hidden right now, but this allows you to automatically change how much you are taxing your estates. It can be useful actually if you just want to make sure that you never make your estates too unhappy by taxing them too much. So like sometimes you'll maybe turn on balance, or actually what's more useful is there are different parts in the actual economy tab itself. So like if we went into this tab and you saw that we could tax the nobility and whatnot, right? You can actually automate each of those tax rates. So you might not necessarily need to go directly to balance here, but you know, it might have its uses sometimes. Trade, super useful. Just hands down, probably the most useful thing to automate in this game. If not the most useful, then second behind production methods. We have to be clear and acknowledge that this game does have like actually 200 different kinds of buildings in them. And so the number of production methods is probably in the several hundred at this point. Trying to manage all of your production methods and all of your trade every single month is an absolute nightmare. I would not wish that upon anybody. So the fact that the trade and production methods are automatable is amazing. We can also see down here, hidden behind my face, the building automation, which I did play around with a little bit. I think I personally like to have more control over what buildings I build, especially as I learn more about the game. I find that the more experience you have, the more you know what what you want to build. And a very similar thing with RGOs, although eventually I do turn on automation for RGOs because they're not actually that expensive to expand. And if your market is lacking something that you can't import, but you can expand in your market, you're not really going to know because you're just automating your trade and production methods. So like maybe you don't know that you can just expand, let's say there's saffron growing in one of your provinces, and saffron is a very, very highly sought after good. It's very expensive in the game. So if you're just doing trade and production methods, you're not even going to notice that you could be expanding your saffron and making a lot of money. So I do eventually turn on the RGO automation as well. But yeah, this excellent system, I wouldn't say 10 out of 10. The trade system might need a little bit of tweaking because it does prioritize mostly money over stuff like what your population needs, or food is one of those big ones. If you turn on trade automation, then it's not going to try and get you food even when your population is starving. That might need a little bit of a change, but when you automate trade, it doesn't just forcefully take over your trading for you. You can go in there and manually add in a few trades like I do later on for wheat. I ask the game like, hey, hold on, I'm going to cancel some of these trades that you did automatically, and I'm going to specifically import wheat from a country to help offset my food problems. And when you do that, because it's a trade that you have created, it has a little button on the left side, I might show this later, but it indicates that that trade will not be touched by the automated system. So you can have this hybrid where you import things you really need manually because you know that you need them, and then you just let the rest of your trade capacity get handled by the automatic trade system. That, in fact, might be one of the best ways to work with the trade system. Now, we do have Gardener down here. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't really know what this one's about. It might have to do with very small scale diplomatic interactions, so I think it has like automatic improved relations in there somewhere. But yeah, I didn't really look at that one, to be honest. It might have automatic cabinet things as well. I don't remember. You might be wondering why I do rival the Eastern Roman Empire and why they're so weak, but I don't go after them. Well, frankly, it's because first I didn't really plan on expanding to begin with, and then second of all, it was because I'm thinking I already have a couple of subjects here. I don't know if I really want to expand further into non-Italian territory, or in other words, territory that I won't really have a chance at accepting, right? It's going to be a different culture, and if you don't at least tolerate that culture, it's very likely you're going to end up getting rebels, and it's going to be very annoying. Now, I could keep that as a long-term vassal, but that would end up also eating up some of my diplomatic capacity, and although you do start with a decent amount as Naples, it's maybe not the greatest thing, and it does kind of bite me a little bit later on when I integrate Austria, because that, for example, is one of those instances where I did have to make a lot of subjects to handle that territory for me. So while I think I could have probably fought and beat the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, you get the choice of what it's called in the game rules, I could have set up vassals or maybe expanded some vassals, but I just didn't really feel like it. If you've been watching a lot of the videos, you've seen at this point that trade is an enormous part of this game. Some people have said it looks like it might be too overpowered. I can kind of see where they're coming from, but on the other end of that, I can say that I never felt like I was making too much money. There was never a point where I felt like, man, I just have so much money and nothing to spend it on, you know what I mean? There was always some kind of a building where I'm like, oh, I need to build that. Like, oh, I can increase my literacy. Oh, I can increase my manpower. I can increase the number of sailors I get. Or on top of that, units, like professional army regiments, insanely expensive. Like armored cavalry, for example, is, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 150 gold to build one unit of 50 soldiers of armored cavalry or heavy cavalry or whatever. They can get insanely expensive. So I do agree that trade is disproportionately a larger source of income compared to everything else. But in terms of how overpowered it is, like, does it give you too much? I would only say yes if it felt like I had an absurd amount of money all the time. And because I never felt that, I don't know, it's powerful, yes, but on the other hand, everything's expensive in this game. Like, a lot of things are really, really expensive. Not least, like, even just boosting up stability and legitimacy can become really expensive. And the price for those things scale based off of your base tax, or I don't remember what it's actually called, but like when you make a lot lot of trade money, your burghers also make a lot of money, and that contributes to your tax base. And because you have a large tax base, that makes it expensive to boost up stability and to boost up your legitimacy. So it does have a little bit of a controlling factor to it. As you can see, for a lot of the game, I was never really making more than like 150 gold per month. And so even though I was making a lot off of trade, not only was I spending a lot on making that trade happen, but I was also spending a lot on other things that were a result of the country becoming richer through trade. So at this point in time, I would say like, yeah, trade is powerful. Does it feel overpowered? Not entirely. I mentioned this briefly at the start of the game that we run out of masonry, mostly to demonstrate that we have stockpiles. Stockpiles are a thing in the game. If you don't produce enough of a thing, or there just isn't enough in the market, then you're not getting anything built. It also highlights the fact that masonry is like the most important early game thing you can build. There will be more of an expansion upon this when I talk about the Greenland experience that I had, where like the only thing you can really do is start by building masonry. It is like literally the building blocks for everything else. The spy networks are interesting because they do take monthly diplomats, as you can see here, just to sustain them. It kind of requires this. Other than that, they function not identically, but very similar to EU4 spy networks. For example, if you have a spy network in a country, like let's say you have 100% spy network, I think it gives you a 20% siege timer reduction. So it speeds up your sieges the same way as it does in EU4. So you can see some of the things that I do in this part. That's not really that important. What I really want to highlight with the Guelphs, maybe, however it's pronounced, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, is that I think it's still a little bit work in progress. I don't explain this in the video because I ran out of time, quite literally. I had to cut that part out for the sake of keeping it under 30 minutes. But I do end up leaving this situation. I leave the faction. And the reason for that is because I think there's a little bit of a bug going on. See, when we go over here and sanction the Empire, I think it gives a slight trade maintenance increase for, I think it's the main leader of the Ghibellines. Now, the Ghibellines can also sanction me, the leader of the Guelphs, and that increases my trade maintenance by, I think it's 10%, except it doesn't do that. At a certain point, it raised my trade maintenance by 550%. And I was joking with Lambert about this on the server, but I think he managed to have me beat, because I think he got his to like 1100%. So like clearly a bug, it'll probably get fixed, because it actually is genuinely game breaking. But yeah, that's the one thing I wanted to mention about this. Like, why did I leave this faction later on? It's because it was literally crippling my economy. If it were fixed, I'm not entirely sure what you're supposed to do with this whole situation. We do have these countries over here that are not quite involved in the situation yet. You can see that they're a little bit grayed out. And there are different sort of gray. It's hard to see, but if we go up to like here, for example, like these countries are also grayed out, but they're not as darkly grayed out as these ones. Maybe there's a better way of showing which countries are eligible, but anyway, there are countries that are not aligned with either of us, and you can invite them to your faction. I think that's the main way that you're supposed to try and weigh things, because the way that the progress is made for these is based on the base tax, or the tax base. I don't remember what it's called, but it's essentially the total amount of money that your estates or your population acquires each month, which you could tax from. And so improving the economy is one way to increase your tax base, but also because it's based on factions, inviting people in is another way of doing that, or just invading the countries that are in the other factions. That's also something you can do. It does take a pretty long time for the situation to finish. I think it's either like somewhere in the 1500s, or if one side progresses to 100%. I think those are the two qualifications. So it takes a while for it to resolve. I don't know really what the outcomes are. Presumably it's something that you're going to want to fight over. So at this point, when we start having food problems, I try to offset it by importing more food and also increasing our production. The main reason I want to increase the production is, I mean, first of all, wheat's super expensive, so we can make money off of that. Second of all, we know we're going to be isolating our market during the Black Death, and also the more production you have of something like wheat in a particular area, the more you can actually modify the direct food production by building things called irrigation. There are these buildings that aren't really buildings because like irrigation's more of a thing, more of a landscaping feature, unless we're talking about like aqueducts and stuff. The main point is you want to end up building up a lot of the production of food in some select locations, because then you can spam up like 8 irrigation buildings, and 8 irrigation buildings would give you 40% increased food production in that tile. So you can get a pretty significant, fairly substantial amount of food from these provinces if you really focus on them. Also, interesting thing about food that I later learned, and I didn't have the time to mention it, is that when you have population that are working as peasants, so like see over here we just have like 36,000 peasants, these peasants will actually produce their own food in subsistence agriculture. And so when you build irrigation, it also increases the amount of food that they just happen to produce on their own. This is important again with the irrigation, because then I could build a lot of irrigation in my capital, which has like 300,000 people in it, 200,000+ of which are peasants, and that subsistence agriculture all of a sudden becomes a real source of food production. It can rival one of the wheat provinces. So that's kind of important. I didn't get to show that off in the video though. So we did have our 2 options, which is basically we can let our female heir, Giovanna, become the queen, which we allow, we make sure that this happens, or we can allow the king of Hungary, who is actually next in line, to become the new king. I said no to the Hungary PU, and in hindsight, I think that was actually a bad idea. I thought that we would lose our union with Provence, and that we would be in a personal union with Hungary, who is significantly stronger than us. And so I was afraid that if I tried to become the senior partner in a union with Hungary, they're just going to kill us over that. Because the AI can. If you become the senior partner, the AI, if they are stronger than you, can say, actually, no, we will declare war and fight you over seniority. So if they somehow vote for us to become the senior partner, but they become unhappy with that, they could declare war on us and become the senior partner. And that could sort of be an issue for us, I felt. 2 things about this segment. First, it gives you a little bit of an indicator on some of the war goals. So we have a Claim Throne CB. I don't actually remember what I get this from for Sicily. We just kind of have it. You actually get a lot of Claim Throne CBs in this game. I got a Claim Throne CB on Sicily as Portugal in the first campaign that I did, and I enforced that union just to see what unions did. But it's kind of interesting because you do get quite a few of these. But anyway, you can find the penalties for conquering as the attacker over here. And interestingly, the conquering cost for the defender is very cheap. So if you end up losing this Claim Throne CB, this war, it could be kind of disastrous for you because of how cheap it is for them to take your stuff. Another important part for this is I do mention that the frames get choppy here. They get choppy here, a different part, and actually a third part that I ended up cutting for time, not because it was choppy. And at those points, I had the wrong graphic settings on. There's like the render settings for which renderer you use, I think. And so that would be either DirectX 12 or Vulkan, and I was using DirectX 12, which I shouldn't have been. Vulkan ended up working a lot better for me. That's what allowed me to get stable frames for the rest of the video. In terms of the general performance, you have to keep in mind I do have a pretty decent GPU. I have a 4070 Ti, and I gotta say, it still was not running that well. We can actually use this section of the video to get into game performance. Once I swapped to the appropriate graphics settings, things did run significantly smoother, even while using VTube Studio and while recording, which is typically the deadly combo, trying to record, use VTube Studio, and have decently running graphics in a game. That being said, I did at some point reduce my resolution to 1080p, whereas typically I play in 1440p because that's the native resolution of my main monitor. And I also I did end up changing some of the settings for my VTube Studio to allow it to run with better frames and to allow the game to run with better frames. That being said, one of the main issues was not actually so much with the graphics, but instead if I played for long enough, the game would slow down, which I also get with EU4. And originally I thought that was an issue with my PC, like maybe there's something wrong with my RAM. Because I think that typically indicates that there's a bit of a memory leak, right? But then I realized like I don't actually have that problem with any other game. So, like, I don't have that problem with CK3, and I don't really have that problem with Victoria 3. So I'm not entirely sure what the issue is, but if you play the game for long enough, it slows down, and then you save the game, close it, reboot it, wow, it works again. Not really sure what that's all about. Hopefully that gets fixed as well. In terms of crashes, I really didn't experience very many at all. Only one really comes to mind, and that's the one that happens in this video. I kept that in intentionally. Outside of that, having played 109 hours of the game and having a handful of crashes, I'd say is fortunate for me. Lucky, even, compared to other people. I know there were other content creators that had a significant number of crashes, like they were having trouble recording their own campaign because of the number of crashes. This part's just kind of funny, mostly a bug. I think the Crusades are not working the way that they're supposed to. At this point, the Papal States decide to basically declare a solo crusade against Egypt. A lot of people have found that it is mostly Egypt that they do the first crusade against. The problem isn't the crusade itself, actually. The problem is the fact that no one joins them. It's just the Papal States. They're the only guys who declare and join the war a lot of the time. In this particular instance, they do bring in a second, like, city-state that doesn't really do much. But this does typically lead to some funny things, where, for example, the Papal States ends up becoming a vassal of the Mamluks pretty reliably. Also, notice that they're called Egypt, even though they are the Mamluks. I think that has to do with the dynamic naming system. So it's called Egypt, but it's called like the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt officially on the map. So we have a little bit of an interesting dynamic naming system going on for a lot of these countries now. There's a lot to explain with Parliament. We have a beautiful excerpt here if you want to pause and read that yourself. This is generally just how it works, but I can give you a brief rundown where you have the Parliament, which is down here. You click the button, it calls in the Parliament, and you get to choose where the Parliament is. As it says, if you move the Parliament to your capital, or if you select your capital, then you move a little bit towards centralization. If you choose a different location, it gains a Parliament location for the duration, which increases the control in that location. I believe it might also be a source of control temporarily, which means that it acts as like a secondary capital, kind of, depending on how much control it gives. A similar thing, by the way, which some buildings can do. Like, for example, a bailiff gives a source of 30 in a location. So the capital is always a source of 100, and then you try to build roads and stuff to make that stretch as far as it can. But in some locations, they're just too far away from the capital. So instead, you need a local proximity source. Bailiffs are the best example in the early game for that. But I think also if you have your Parliament in a different location, it does a similar thing temporarily for the duration of the Parliament. It also moves you towards decentralization. As for the bonuses you see on the left side here, these are not entirely random. They are somewhat random, but if you pick one of these, then it won't be available for the next couple of parliaments. So that's why I was thinking, like, hey, we can conduct a census, or we can do something else and try to keep that for later, because I know that the Black Death is coming in a couple of years. What is that, like 8 years or something? And you can only call the Parliament once every, I think it's 5 or so years. So if we use the census now, we won't be able to use the census directly after the Black Death runs its course. So I'm thinking, okay, instead I should pick something else. We also need food, so we go for food. These numbers on the right side are the starting support. So some of the more powerful estates are suggesting these, and of course they're going to back them. When you, the crown, are suggesting something, you don't really get much out of that. So if the burghers, for example, want additional mining operations, they're going to support it. But the burghers, they don't make up a significant portion of the actual power base. So their support is marginal at best. The nobility are totally behind any of these things, because typically they will support anything that in some way, even in a roundabout way, will increase their own power. So for example, promoting castle cost works is great for them because that makes it cheaper to build castles. And if you build castles, it increases their power. I think same thing with funding farming estates, but that might be an interaction between serfdom and how the RGOs work. I don't entirely remember. It's possible some of these are actually just tied to different factions for the sake of tying them to different factions, or estates rather. Like, for example, we can expand the mining operations, but at this point in time, the law we have for mining operations is actually still nobility-controlled mining. So it doesn't make too much sense that the burghers want this when the nobility control the mining. But anyway, that's basically how parliaments work. And a lot of countries have a form of parliament. It isn't always called parliament, by the way. It's not meant to be a formal, strict definition of a parliament. It can be like a council or whatever. It's meant to be a convening of the estates. I know someone asked that question earlier in the last video, so just to clarify, I think every country that I've played so far has a form of this, including the tribe in North America that I played. I forgot to mention there's more to the parliament. If you have over 50% support, then you can ask for one of these 4 things from them. You get support from basically making concessions. Those concessions can range from either changing one of your societal values in some way, so you'll move like, say, 5% towards serfdom to get support from the nobility, for example. But it can also be like a law change, or to give them a privilege, or they can ask you to improve your relation with a different country, or to harm your relations with another country, or to even break one of your alliances. So they might ask for a number of things in exchange for support. If you have over 50% support, then the issue always passes. If you have less than 50%, then it does not pass. If you fail to pass the parliament issue, then you will lose 7% stability, and if you pass, then you get whatever the passing thing is. And I say that specifically because there are actually 2 effects whenever you choose a parliament issue. As you can see, for example, here, we have one where if it passes, right? And then we have another one during the debate. So sometimes, even if you know you're not going to end up passing the actual parliament issue, sometimes the debate is worth it on its own. In fact, that's one of the most useful parts of being able to conduct a census, is that during the ongoing debate, it gives you that 0.5% global population growth for that period. And I think that period is 180 days, maybe, somewhere around that. So if you have a project in mind, like you know you're going to want to build a whole bunch of roads, then maybe it's worth waiting until the parliament comes back so that you can debate whether or not you want to expand the road network. During that debate, it makes roads, I think, 20 or 30% cheaper to build, which is pretty good because roads can get very expensive very quickly. On top of that, if you have over 50% in the parliament, over 50% support, you can actually exchange that support for one of these 4 actions. Requesting additional taxes increases the amount that you're allowed to tax all of your estates by, I think it's 10%. I don't remember how long that lasts. But remember, the more you tax your estates, the unhappier they are, so it's not always worth it. You can also ask for larger levies, which is pretty self-explanatory. It increases your levy size for a short period of time. You can ask for a law change, which I do demonstrate a couple of times in this video. It just makes it cheaper in terms of stability to change a law, and typically those are rather expensive, so it's usually a good idea in my opinion. And then the last one is preparing for war. This gives you an insult CB against somebody else, and you get to choose who that is. Here we get to Antagonism, the replacement for aggressive expansion in EU5. I would say Antagonism, probably a far better system, because Antagonism is not just you taking stuff from people. That's not the only thing that increases antagonism. There is a baseline of antagonism between you and countries which have a different culture, or have a different religion, or if your cultures have negative views on each other, I think might be one of them, which makes it so that you actually need to be extra careful when dealing with certain countries. So in this case, it's actually more lenient for us to take stuff from Catholic countries, because at the very least, we're Catholic. And when we take stuff from Sicily, we're also Italian. So like, it's not that crazy. But if we invaded Tunis, and we took some of that land that's not Italian, it's not Catholic, so they have a level of baseline antagonism, I think it adds up to 15 at this point for a lot of countries. That means that we can take far less stuff before a coalition begins to form. We might as well also get into coalitions at that point, right? So coalitions, I believe, begin to form at 40 antagonism. I don't think it's 50, I think it's 40 antagonism. And they form as international organizations very similar to a union, or the Catholic Church, or the Guelphs, or the Ghibellines, or whatever. All these international organizations have a similar template that they work from, and coalitions are a dynamic dynamic version of that. Because I didn't play very aggressively, I can't tell you when people decide to leave coalitions or when they decide to attack you or any of those things. Just simply that they're kinda different. Okay, we get to talk about the age system. So as mentioned both in the announcement and as you probably saw in many videos, there are 6 ages in EU5. We have the age of traditions, the age of Renaissance, the age of discovery, the age of Reformation, the age of absolutism, and the age of revolutions. In each of these ages, you are presented with a choice: the administrative, diplomatic, or military foci. I'd say this is one of the main systems that's going to influence the way that you decide to play your particular country. So as I mentioned, the reason we go with administrative focus is because I'm not planning to conquer too much, which, despite how much we expand in the first age, is still actually consistent. Mostly because a lot of my expansion comes from integrating my union, right? And we're not really fighting too many wars, not attempting to expand aggressively or anything like that, so there's no real reason to take the military focus. I should have mentioned, actually, these are additional technologies. So there are a bunch of technologies that everybody gets per age. There are some you get for being a specific country, or a specific religion, or a specific culture, or even a specific region. For example, Quest for the New World, I believe, is only available to countries that are in the Western Europe region, which could be disappointing for some people, but it's not really the end of the world. Yes, you can still colonize if you're playing in Asia, like Japan or Korea, or I believe, if you manage to survive as you won, I suppose, you could actually colonize still. Now, that being said, whenever you pick something, one of these foci, for the entire age, you get an additional branch of innovations unique to whatever you picked. So when I say we don't need the military focus, it's because we don't really need additional levies, we don't really need stronger armies, we don't really need to be projecting strength or anything. We don't need to be significantly stronger than anybody, because I don't plan on getting a massive coalition and taking enormous amounts of land. But you can for some countries, right? Like, we chose something different because I was playing Naples, and I had a different plan. But if you're playing like the Ottomans, as you might have seen with Habibi's video, you can do a lot of expansion in the early game. So you might actually want the military focus. Or you could, if you wanted to, go with the diplomatic focus. Because in the early game, when you take a lot of territory, there's a good chance you can't actually hold on to that. Instead, you're going to have to produce a significant number of subjects. So if you're going to have to make a lot of subjects, then the diplomatic focus could be pretty useful. Or if you need to integrate a bunch of subjects, maybe whatever's in that diplomatic focus can be useful. For me, I'm thinking I want to play tall in the first stage. I want to get my literacy up, I want to increase the cultural influence I have so that I can expand my assimilation attempts, so that I can focus more on integrating cultures rather than trying to tolerate or accept them, so that, I open up some of that cultural capacity to accept more cultures down the line. I will explain the cultural system a little bit later on, but yeah, so I went with admin focus because I figured, we don't really have to integrate the subjects that we have right now. There isn't much of a benefit to integrating Achaia or the Albanian subjects we have. There's really not too much to gain from that, so I figure it's fine. We're not going to go with diplomatic focus. There are a few trade benefits in here, like privateers. You get access to privateers, you get the merchant traditions, you get shrewd commerce, you get claim fabrication, which actually I didn't even realize is in the diplomatic focus, but there you go. I guess that's how you fabricate claims in the early game. And then you go over here to admin. This is the stuff that I really wanted, like the local infrastructure. Is that the one that makes it cheaper to build roads? Or is that the one that gives you the cathedrals? I don't remember. Might be the roads one. Here we have our institutions. There are 3 per age, so it's a lot more, of course, than in EU4, but they do function in a pretty similar way. They spawn in a location, and then they spread from that location to other places. One of the main differences, though, is that you cannot simply will the institution into existence. In EU4, you can develop a province and just snap the institution into existence. I don't think there's any analog for that in EU5. If there is, I haven't found it. And so these institutions are kind of more important in that sense, or they're more important to pay attention to. especially, I would say, the one that we have up on screen, professional armies. This one is incredibly consequential. First of all, whoever spawns this gets 50 additional manpower per month in the province that it is spawned in, and that's permanent in that province. In the early game, that is genuinely ridiculous, like an actually insane amount of manpower. It's hard to see because, YouTube, and so it's dimmed at the top, but up here you can see that I'm making 5 manpower per month currently, and that's because of a building called a sergeantry, which you only get one of, and you can only build it in the capital, and you have to embrace professional armies and get the other building, I don't remember what it's called, the barracks or whatever, that can give you additional manpower and can be built in any city or any town. So if you spawn professional armies, you start with an immediate advantage where you get 11 times the manpower per month that any other country in the game gets at this point. Unless, of course, well, it's not any other country in the game. There are unique buildings like the Ottomans get to have their Janissaries. Those are unique manpower buildings. And, the Mamluks, I believe, get their slave armies or something. But professional armies is one of the most important ones, because if you don't have those unique things that I just mentioned, then you don't have a lot of manpower, which means you don't have a large professional army. And one professional army unit can outclass several times its size of levies. So like 100 professional infantry versus 200 levies. The professional infantry, absolutely clear that. It's no contest. On top of that, professional armies also locks being able to get cannons, also super useful. Better infantry units like the hand cannons, the hand gunners. So I'd say the institutions are definitely something to pay attention to. So I end up going to war with Aragon for a no CB war to take all of Sardinia. Now, I'm not aware at this point that I can't take all of Sardinia. When you declare a no CB war, anything you take is actually double the cost. So it's kind of like actually in the Claim Throne CB, where you saw we had a plus 100% cost to conquer. Same thing with the no CB. No CB is also interesting because I think it's intentional. Yes, it might be a little bit annoying that you don't have easy access to CBs if you didn't take the diplomatic focus, right? You don't have that fabricate claim technology that you would have gotten. But the thing about the no CB wars is I think they're very intentional at the start of the game. It's not just that it's difficult to get a reasonable CB, but actually that they encourage this. It costs stability. It gives you additional antagonism. It makes it more expensive to take provinces. All of these things I feel are intentional, not least because I think they want you to focus on playing tall at the start of the game, but also there is an innovation, a particular technology that reduces the cost to declare no CB wars. So that indicates to me that this is intentional. Now, do I like this? Honestly, yes. I'm a big fan of this. I think it's fine that if you're playing a country that isn't meant to be super expansionist at the start of the game, or doesn't have anything that really leans them in that general direction, this is kind of fine. It sort of naturally encourages you to have an inward focus. Now, if you don't like that playstyle, then pick the diplomatic focus. That gives you the ability to fabricate claims. Or, actually, in the admin focus, you can get claims. There's a Holy War CB that you get access to. So see, down here at the bottom of the admin focus, there is Deus Vult here, and this innovation actually allows you to fabricate Holy War CBs. So there is something for you to do with this, with the admin focus as well. It's just that you're more limited compared to if you took the diplomatic focus, or, well, honestly, I'm not sure what's up with the military focus, because I don't think it necessarily gives you CBs. But again, I haven't really looked at that too much, so I'm not sure. I suspect military focus makes sense if you're playing a country that already has CBs, as I previously mentioned. If you want to be expansionist, but you don't automatically get something, then maybe pick diplomatic. If you're planning to play relatively tall, like you want to go to war with countries that are a different religion, then for sure, admin still works for you. It's totally fine. So we end up seeing my navy get absolutely stack wiped here, and the main reason for that is because these are levy transports. They do not have any artillery on them, so like they don't have any cannons. They can't fight. So they get immediately stack wiped by any navy that does have cannons. Hospitals are obviously a pretty good idea when you're about to enter into the Black Death. They do give you a very small amount of plague resistance. The plus 10% is not that substantial, but when you have like 300,000 people in that one city, it's a pretty good idea. Ideally, if you have the money for it, you want to build a lot of these. Anywhere that you have, as you can see here, either a level 2 or level 3 settlement, this is a town, and this is a city. Wherever you have a town or a city with substantial population, you should probably try to build one of these before the Black Death comes. After that, you do sometimes get plagues, but it's usually not that bad. This is mostly for the Black Death. When we end up getting this event, the Hungarian King of Naples, so I'm assuming that this is a historical event, and that makes sense because when you have this little book icon in one of them, like over here, this actually indicates that this is a historical event, or rather that this is the historical option taken for this event. So when this event rolled around, I actually made a really big mistake, or rather, like, I thought what was going to end up happening is that because this guy ends up becoming the king, I thought that would end up becoming like a really big issue, like as in Hungary would get a personal union over us. That's what I thought what was happening because I didn't read it enough. But essentially it would just make him the king, and that's it, right? Now that doesn't mean that we would be in a personal union with Hungary. That's not what's going on here. But instead I decide like, no, we're not going to let him be the king because this is actually the consort, right? So the queen's in charge. This is the queen's consort. We have this event where the consort wants to become the king, not just a consort. And so we can either let him or not let him. And by not letting him, what ends up happening is I actually end up royal marrying our current queen because that guy dies. The consort dies. And so our current queen gets to marry somebody else. And I decide to make the decision where she ends up marrying the king of Hungary. I mean, I barely have proximity in the places that matter within the mainland of my country. This is several sea tiles away. So I wouldn't really be able to do that much with this territory anyway. Like, I wouldn't be able to collect very many taxes. This stuff's in the Tunisian market. You know, I can't collect any taxes from it. I could tolerate the culture, I guess. Like, I could upgrade the culture to become tolerated or accepted. That's true. But I would also have to spend time using a cabinet member to integrate this territory. And until I accept the culture that's there, I won't be able to get a core on it anyway. So I decide, you know what, I'm just going to release a subject. I think I end up releasing them as a fiefdom, although maybe I shouldn't have, because fiefdoms are a form of subject that are like vassals. They're pretty much identical, except they can be integrated at double the speed, and they take up, I don't know if it's double the actual diplomatic capacity, but they take up more. So if you're going to make a fiefdom, it's something that you're planning on integrating relatively soon. An example for that might be like, let's say you're playing Scotland, you're playing Highland Culture Scotland. We'll probably get to this in a different video, but if you're Highland Culture, then Irish Culture pops are like really friendly with you, like both of your cultures are friendly. So it's worth integrating Ireland because you will get cores on Ireland because you can very easily accept Irish culture. And so if you're going to make a subject in Ireland and feed it a whole bunch, it's worth it to turn that into a fiefdom. But I probably shouldn't have made these guys a fiefdom because I think I kept them around for like another 30 years. And so that probably wasn't a good idea. But when you create a subject, they end up having their own local control, right? So like they have their own capital, which creates proximity. And so because they have high proximity for their provinces that they now own, they can increase their control and they can core their own territories that are their own culture, which means they start making money. They can start improving that territory for you, building buildings, for example, using their cabinet members to develop the land or whatever they want to do there. And in the end, they can pay you a little bit in taxes. It's not going to be a significant amount in a lot of cases, but it could be more than you would get just from keeping them as part of your territory. So in the early game, playing with the vassals is really quite important if you're planning to expand into territories that you don't really have a way to accept the cultures in. In fact, subjects, I think, are going to be instrumental for most of the game, far more than they are in EU4 at least. Now, when the Black Death arrives to your country, it's very concerning. I tried to isolate my country, and what that button does is it actually cuts off all foreign trade, which means nobody is allowed to trade with you. However, this cuts off trade from foreign merchants to your market. It does not cut off intra-market trade, which refers to trade between different countries within the same market. So countries outside of your market could not trade with your market, but like the Papal States or some part of the Papal States, for example, can still trade because they're in the Naples market. They can't leave that market. They're already in there. And so if they get the Black Death, that's going to spread through intra-market trade. And I think that's what ended up happening in the end. So we can see, for example, that the Black Death has spread. And why is that? Well, I think it's because this province is in my market. Right over here in Albania, This province is part of the Naples market, I believe, at this point. And so it can spread from here all the way over here. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Or, whoever is within my market still. So it could be a province here. It could be provinces here. It depends on how far my market has spread. But I'm pretty sure that's what happened in this case. At that point, is it worth it to just do trade anyway? Well, I don't know. I'm still kind of fiddling around to see what the best way of surviving the Black Death is. If you can get your mortality rate down to about 40%, that's one of the better outcomes. And so one of the ways we did that, of course, is expelling the sick. I think it's the best outcome, because if you want to procure remedies, I think it ends up being expensive and doesn't help that much. Segregating the infected is like a worse version of expelling the sick, pretty much. So yeah, just expel the sick. It's not great, but it works. I do try to go for recovery effort in a few places. This little thing on the left here. This is prosperity. I don't actually remember how you get prosperity. I think it's just built up over time when nothing bad happens. Or like if people have their needs met, maybe. I don't remember. But anyway, if prosperity is down, then you can use a cabinet action to increase prosperity. On the bright side, it also gives you a boost to your population growth in that area for the time that you're like actually doing it, which is pretty useful after you have a plague that destroys 40% of your population. And then, of course, yeah, because a bunch of people died, we didn't have any more food shortages. We solved a lot of the food problems because most of the population that died was, of course, urban, right? Because diseases and urban and cities and stuff, right? That's just kind of how it works. So when a lot of the urban population ends up dying and we're left with a large rural population, we end up having a surplus of food for the most part, which is great. It does kind of actually solve the problem, but the problem does come back later, so it's not a permanent solution, which is good because of course you want to fix their population. And we can actually see here just how devastating it was, just how much the urban population was destroyed. This whole request exclusive trade rights thing is only available for a country that has their market isolated, so I figure that means, of course, France is still isolating their market, or many of their markets. I don't remember if France is one or two, but essentially, yeah, you're going to want to try and negotiate trading rights with some of the countries in the early game because they tend to keep themselves isolated even after the Black Death has kind of left their country. I don't know if that'll change. Hopefully it does, because it does get a little tedious having to go to each country being like, hey, we actually don't have the plague. Do you want to trade again? Usually they say yes at the very least. I haven't encountered any country that says no to that request, but it is still a little bit tedious. And then we get to embracing institutions. We can see directly how expensive it is to embrace an institution based on how much of our population has been exposed to that institution, so how much we have that institution in our country. I think it works in a different way than EU4, where in EU4 you either don't have the institution in a province or you do. It's completely binary. It grows over time, but until you have it at 100%, you don't actually have it. I think that might be different in EU5. After getting meritocracy, we research a couple of techs. Efficiency of the cabinet, self-explanatory. It's just how effective your cabinet actions are. Tax efficiency, kind of makes sense maybe. It's just for whatever tax rate that you set, you can get more money in taxes for that rate. Trade efficiency is, I think, just a modifier that applies to how much money you make off of a trade. Literacy makes a lot of sense. Again, we want to increase our population's literacy so that we can do faster research. And then eventually I go down to building gravel road cost because roads are rather expensive. I later realized that when we have this queen, this is a new queen. This is not the same queen as the last one. And the reason why my union with Hungary disappeared is actually because the King of Hungary was no longer married to the Queen of Naples. The Queen of Naples died during the plague, right? If you remember that. Which means we didn't actually have our union with Hungary for quite some time by that point. We actually had a regent rule the country for a couple of years, and then the new queen came of age, and so because she came of age, she could marry, and I happened to notice that the current Duke of Austria is unmarried. So just like before, how our queen married the King of Hungary and formed a union, we were able to have our new queen marry the Duke of Austria and form a new union. Here's an example of something unique for a country. Specifically, playing Naples, you get the royal domain. It's a unique innovation that you get. Gives you 10% crown power. I would say that these innovations in some way somewhat replace national ideas from EU4. So if you didn't have these innovations and you still have the idea system, this would just be one of Naples' ideas. Like, this is just something that you can get for playing as Naples. So things like that are scattered throughout the game that kind of give individual countries unique flavor. At least that's where we're at so far in terms of countries having unique flavor. So that is the first thing that I want, because the more crown power I have, the easier I can revoke the privileges from the rest of the estates, as well as giving me a couple of other bonuses that I frankly forget. I go after art schools because I think they give you a little bit of literacy, but also give you cultural tradition, or maybe cultural influence, I don't remember. Either way, it's a unique capital building, you can only build one of them, and it's pretty important for the Renaissance because it is part of the whole, like, developing your culture's power, which I think I can get to a little bit later. I also queue up wanting to get more crown power, and then I want to get universities, which of course also just happens to give me another plus 5% plague resistance, pretty useful. It also gives us that additional culture capacity that we see later on. But the main thing about the university is not just the law that it gives you, which we can talk about later when it comes up, but also the fact that universities are incredibly important for both maximum literacy and growing literacy. And so because you can build them actually in any town or city, they end up being really useful for increasing the average literacy of your population, and that of course allows you to research faster. As you can see, we do end up getting a third reform for our government, and for this one I decided to go with Royal Decree because, again, crown power is amazing. To be honest, I don't know what state satisfaction volatility means. I think it means that if you have an estate's target satisfaction and it's not currently where it's supposed to be, the volatility changes how quickly it moves towards that new equilibrium, if I had to guess. And then additionally, we also get that centralization. And then we get to the actual union itself. This is where people had the most concerns, which is fair, very reasonable, but I think I can do a decent job of explaining unions. So as we mentioned, the union that we have right now exists purely because our current queen on the left side here is married to the king, or rather the Duke of Austria on the right side here. This is the main part of the union between us and Austria. See, we don't actually have a claim to the continued inheritance of Austria. If we went down to here and codified the inheritance, then I think that would end up being the case. But because I didn't do that with the Hungarian personal union, I think that's what ended up happening. I think we lost it. The Provence, Sicily, and the other two ones, the game starts out with those ones, which makes me think that, like, those are kind of hard-coded to stick with you, even if your character, or like the main person, dies. Or maybe it's because at this point they all share the same line of succession, just by coincidence, having the same succession laws and whatnot. Maybe that's why. The throne of Austria, on the other hand, doesn't really have anything to do with our current inheritance laws. As far as Austria is concerned, the son of the Duke here is probably going to inherit Austria. And depending on how our laws are and how that plays out, it's very likely that whatever son or daughter, or depending on the succession laws, is a product of these two will end up just naturally inheriting everything anyway. But if we centralize the union, that pretty much guarantees it. So the first thing you do is the senior partner. You decide who the senior partner is in this whole personal union. And when you do that, there are three options. It's going to cost you legitimacy and prestige. That's this stuff right over here. And then it's also going to cost you some money from the union treasury. So every union has its own treasury, and the contribution each month is what people pay to that treasury. On top of that, you can decide to manually make a donation, which we can see over here. You can choose to manually contribute a certain amount of gold to the organization treasury. And then you use the money in that treasury, the money is stored up here. You use this money to actually pass through these centralization laws. And so I decided to make myself the administrative senior partner, and everyone ends up voting in accordance with this. The thing about unions right now is I feel like they are not quite done, because I've never experienced the AI ever push back against an attempt at centralization. See, the other members of the union have to vote every single time we pass one of these policies, but they always vote yes. I've never seen any of them vote no. And that might be one of the problems with how unions are currently. In fact, we had somebody play as Holland and integrate England in a union, because England just did not push back against Holland attempting to aggressively integrate them into the, Hollandish administration. So when you see me passing through these centralization laws, that's pretty much what's happening. I'm donating a whole bunch of money to the organization, and then I'm just immediately going through the next policy. I wait for the vote to pass, everybody always votes yes, and then I move on to the next one. And I do that 6 times until we get down to the unification of crowns. At this point, I start to realize just how powerful trade can be, especially once I free myself from being in that situation that was tanking my trade. So I start building max marketplaces in literally every town and every city. And by doing that, we get insane trade capacity, which we can use to import and export from our market. And that, of course, gives us a whole lot of money to work with, which allows us to build more marketplaces. And then once we cap out on that, that's when we end up doing a little bit more with different buildings. Then you can see when I'm trying to revoke this privilege from the nobility, it only costs about 50 stability. I think at the base rate, it costs 100. I don't quite remember. But as we've been reducing the nobility's power, increasing the crown power, and also moving towards communalism, this has become cheaper over time. If I tried to revoke this at the start of the game, it would be at least 75 stability, if not higher, maybe even 90. But because we've been working hard at it, we can actually only spend 50 to make this happen. So at this point, we have unified the whole union together. This includes many of the things up here in this region of southern and like southwestern Germany, a little bit into Switzerland. So what I end up doing at that point, after forming 2 Sicilies, of course, is I go over here, I create a subject over in this part. I release, I think it's Carniola in this region. And then up here, I release Styria. I ended up releasing Styria because Austria at that point had their culture changed to Neapolitan. If you remember earlier from integrating that union, that's what it does, which is kind of weird. But yeah, if I release Austria, they would be Neapolitan culture, and that was not a good outcome. So I released Styria. Styria ended up actually forming Austria again, which was interesting. And then the biggest issue I had was actually over here in the west. All of these basically disconnected little pieces of land are their own subjects. There's a subject here, another subject here, another one here, another one here, and another one here. There are a lot of subjects that I had to make, specifically because I could not use any of this stuff. It would not be the right culture. I could not accept that culture. I would have no control. I would receive no taxes. I wouldn't get anything out of this. As you can see from integrating Sicily, I do receive a couple of cores because Sicilian culture is accepted by us. And I end up keeping Provence because we go over here and start accepting the Provençal culture. And we can see that if we decide to tolerate it, which we're already starting at, it only uses 0.4 cultural capacity. If we accept it, it costs 1.2. Now, I do end up doing that because the technology that I previously mentioned happens to finish at that exact point, and so I accept the culture, and that gives me cores on Provence's stuff. Now, going back to culture, you can see a few things. We have cultural influence and cultural tradition. Cultural influence is basically how you affect other cultures, and it says it's useful in the context of what they call culture war, but I don't think that's a thing that exists in the early game. At least if it is, I have not encountered it yet. But for cultural influence, if you have a lot of it early on, it can be used to speed up your assimilation of different areas. So if you want to culture convert a region, having high cultural influence makes that faster. But it is relative. So if the culture you're trying to convert has high cultural tradition and your cultural influence isn't very high, then they will resist your conversion attempts. It will be much slower if their tradition is higher than your cultural influence. Now, when we're talking about what influences the cost of accepting or tolerating a culture, it has a couple of things. If you're in a similar group, it's going to be a little bit cheaper. If you share a language, it's going to be a little bit cheaper. And if your culture likes that other culture, has a positive opinion, then that also makes it cheaper. So, for example, down here, we can see that Greco here has a positive opinion of our culture, which is Neapolitan. Now, this actually does not make it cheaper for us to embrace, or rather to accept or tolerate, Greco culture. If a country were Greco and trying to accept Neapolitan culture, it would make it cheaper. Because what matters is the dominant culture's opinion on the other culture. That is what affects that dynamic. And then finally, as I mentioned, I was doing some cultural assimilation. And the reason for that is because that also affects the capacity usage. The size of the population of that culture versus the size of your culture's population. So by doing some conversion, we can actually reduce the amount it costs to embrace Sicilian culture. If I start converting Sicilian here, or converting any Sicilian here, that'll actually make it cheaper to maintain our integration of Sicilian culture, so that it frees up some capacity to try and accept or tolerate other cultures. While I'm here, I might as well talk about control because I referenced it here. Control has to do with, of course, how much you can actually get out of a province. We can see the effects down here actually. So it reduces the crown power impact from a province, reduces the manpower, the sailors, the promotion speed, the conversion speed, the assimilation speed, the levy size, and it reduces how much influence your market has on that. When I move to the unitary administration, it's mostly for centralization again, and also for distance cost to capital. This has to do with proximity again. The higher the distance cost to the capital, the lower the proximity is. So if you can reduce the distance cost, then it ends up increasing the proximity. And when you have higher proximity, it increases your control. And so that's just kind of how the whole system works. Basically, increase proximity to increase control. There are some other buildings that do increase control at a flat rate, and we'll get to those a little bit later. Next, I go for some research. As I mentioned earlier, the armory building is incredibly important because it is the only building for most countries that allows you to have more manpower per month. It is the first building you receive that allows this, and so if you are late getting armories, you are late to building a professional army, and so you are late to the technological arms race. In other words, you're cooked. Next, education law. I went for education of the people because I wanted that juicy max literacy for peasants. Peasants make up the majority of the population, so if you can increase their maximum literacy, then that's going to allow us to increase our research speed quite considerably. It does make the estates unhappy, but they just have to live with that, and it gives you monthly progress towards innovative and humanist. What's interesting about humanist is that it actually has this dichotomy with religious, where the more humanist you are, the faster you can culture convert, but the more religious you are, the faster you can religiously convert. And then the dichotomy between innovative and traditionalist is, again, it has to do with institutions. The more traditionalist you are, the more expensive it is to embrace institutions, and the more innovative you are, the cheaper it is to embrace institutions. That's the main thing that stuck out to me. I think there are other modifiers, but frankly, I do not remember them, and I don't have access to check them anymore. Here's an example of bailiffs and roads. I'm building a bailiff in the center here, which can only be built in a non-town or non-city location, meaning it has to be a level 1 location. It cannot be a level 2 like this. So I build it here, and then I go to each location and build a road to that bailiff. The bailiff provides 30 local proximity source. It acts like a capital, but only up to 30 proximity, whereas a capital is 100. And so by building this bailiff here, we get the 30 proximity, and then by building the road, it decreases the distance cost from this bailiff to, for example, this town. So this gives the town a little bit of proximity. I don't think it ends up being much, maybe like at most 15 to 20%. So really not huge, but that does still give you a reasonable amount of increased control. And then here I change away from the noble controlled mining operations to the burghers because I want to reduce the cost of expanding mining. We don't really care about how long it takes because frankly, we don't do it all too often. And on top of that, instead of moving ourselves towards a traditional economy with aristocracy, we want to move towards plutocracy and that juicy capital economy. Because again, the closer we get to a capital economy, the more our buildings will produce instead of our resource gathering operations. I do get around to changing the distribution of power. The reason why it was a toss-up for me between the ruler and the burghers is that I did actually want to give it to the burghers. I wanted that maximum tax increase for the burghers because they can get me a lot more money. But then I thought about it and I'm like, you know what? I've been giving a little too much to the burghers. Like, maybe I shouldn't have this much progress towards plutocracy. Maybe that's not good for us. And besides, I can get more tax from the other estates in general down here, and I can get the 20% crown power. A pretty good deal. Even if the the other estates aren't a huge fan of that, because we get more crown power, we can just hand out more privileges. And the privileges are usually helpful anyway, so why not? Okay, so the reason I'm looking up here when I'm talking about the rebellion that's happening is because I thought that this was the country rebelling from me. It's not. I just saw this and I'm like, wait a second, army? War? That's bad. But actually, it's because the rebellion was happening like right up here, I think. Very difficult to see this, but you see how there's like a U here? That is the name of a different country that has just revolted from me. And so the way that this works is when you have a country revolting from you, it's not like an EU4 rebel situation. They cause more like a civil war. They rise up as an independent country, fighting for their independence, and if there is a country near them that shares the same culture, that country is actually dragged into the war. This could be cheesable in the future, maybe. It sort of means that, like, if there's a country you don't want to declare war on, you can just make pops of their culture really angry, let them revolt, boom, now they've declared war on you. And of course, I use this opportunity to take massive chunks out of the Papal States. So that kind of works as proof of concept. These pops were upset. I don't have to declare war on the Papal States, which, mind you, at this point, the Papal States are a subject of the Mamluks. They're a subject of Egypt, which means if I declare war on the Papal States, I'm not in for a good time. But because this population revolts, brings in the Papal States, and now I'm fighting them, I'm like, okay, free territory, sounds good to me. We can see their overlord is the Sultanate of Egypt, right? They're a vassal of Egypt, but I'm not fighting Egypt. I am fighting the Papal States, and I get to take free things. I end up researching artillery at this point because artillery does kind of function the same way it does in EU4. If you have enough artillery, it gives you a bonus for your fort. There is a thing called like artillery power or like siege power or something that artillery provides, and it's a certain amount per regiment. I don't even remember how much it took for me to get 0.5, which counts as a full level or something. It might have been like 6 artillery for 1 level. Could be 5 actually. 5 would seem like a reasonable number, but it also depends on the fort, so I don't quite remember. I also get the hand gunners over here, basically just a better version of the infantry that we have. They're just a flat upgrade. So we end up having a bit of an issue here where we get absolutely destroyed by the Papal States before the reinforcing levies can even arrive. Just to give you a little idea of how quickly battles unfold in this game, you're not having your 3-month-long EU4 battles anymore. These things are done within like days, oftentimes before a reinforcing army can even get there. Literally 1 tile away doesn't even get there on time, right? And so I think what ended up happening here is the enemy just has artillery and I don't. They have 2 units of artillery, I have no artillery, they have better cavalry as well, larger numbers, generally speaking. I'm sieging down a province, and maybe I have like a river crossing penalty or something, I don't know. A bunch of issues happened here where I just got absolutely collapsed upon. So I lose this army, the other army gets locked in by the time we lose, so they go in, their levies, so they get absolutely slaughtered. Just to give you some perspective on how powerful a professional army is, 2,700 troops left, we have almost 10,000, and the levies get absolutely destroyed. 14 people walk out of that battle. So that's why you should probably get professional armies. It's a pretty good idea. Now, fortunately at this point, I had already finished building a lot of my... I literally saw what these are called and I didn't remember, but these ones, okay? These buildings are important. Armories, the names are right here. Okay, so all these armories, I've been building a bunch of them. You can see my manpower up here has started to increase pretty drastically, so I'm not too worried. I can just rebuild this army and walk back in. On the other hand, the Papal States, they don't get to replenish that army, or if they do, they simply don't have the capabilities. They don't have the manpower. So in the end, I win anyway, as we know. But that is a useful lesson in army strength. You might also be wondering, why did they surrender? Well, I guess it kind of spoils it for you, doesn't it? The attacker has way too much war exhaustion. So because the attacker here, Papal States, they've actually, it's interesting, they don't even have that much war exhaustion, but there is a new modifier in the game called maximum war exhaustion. And so the amount of war exhaustion you can have can actually vary. And you might notice they're the only one left in this war. But wait, there were 2 countries. What happened to the other one? Well, in the middle of the war, the Papal States actually just absorbed the other territory. They joined the Papal States, and the Papal States continued to fight the war against me. Unfortunately for the Papal States, they don't have a lot of war exhaustion allocation. So as they've been fighting battles and we've been sieging stuff and we sacked Rome a little bit and then we walked over, they've been getting too much war exhaustion, and when that happens, you are forced to have negative 100 war score. That's a pretty big change. In EU4, you would have to siege pretty much every single province of a country and delete their army before they will surrender 100% to you. Not quite what happens in EU5 anymore, and it means you do have to worry about that war exhaustion a little bit. Not least because war exhaustion is also pretty punishing. It can significantly reduce your ability to raise levies, and it can significantly reduce your population growth speed. If there's a lot of war exhaustion, your population is just not going to increase after a certain point. Or I think it might even begin to shrink, which isn't what's happening here. People are just starving. Don't worry about it. I do fix that at some point. But also because we haven't ended up sieging this province, which is what I want to have that back, but it has a fort on it. So because I didn't siege it, it means we can't actually take it until it is sieged. Pretty similar rules to EU4, kind of. Or actually, it might be closer to Imperator Rome, now that I really think about it. So we end up going back and crushing the Papal Army. This is a mix of professional and levy units at this point. We have enough professional units to outnumber their professional units, so it's a pretty easy battle. I just wanted to keep the levies along for the ride, pretty much. Then I raise a few more levies, go to siege this province. Pretty easy to siege it because actually there's like nobody there guarding it. 3 people, those 3 poor souls left to guard this fort, so we take that instantly. I found that assaulting forts is actually significantly easier in EU5 than it is in EU4. Like, it's not nearly as costly. It doesn't even cost you anything to click the button, and you don't need to breach. In EU4, if you want to make sure you take a fort by assaulting it, you need to first press the breach button by firing a barrage from your artillery, and then you need to spend more mill points clicking the assault fort button. In this case, you just press the button. That's it. And it doesn't even kill that many people. Like, to actually take this fort, how many people died? What do we have left? Like 9,000 people? More than 9,000 people? And what did we start with here? Like 10.5-ish thousand? So what did we lose? Like 1,000 people sieging this fort? That's actually not too bad. That's really easy. When you look up here and it's like, oh, that's like 4 months of manpower. Like that's not a big deal. And I did that mostly with levies too. So with professional units, it's even faster. And imagine if we did have a breach from artillery, you know, like it actually seems pretty easy. In fact, the first time that this failed, it was only because we ran out of morale. We didn't even run out of troops. The morale went down and it's like, oh, we can't win this anymore. Let's just try it again when the morale goes back up. So we lose like 1,000 people and take a fort within 2 weeks. That's acceptable. That's pretty okay. Then the other weird thing is, for some reason, as you can see, I'm trying to take stuff and it just doesn't count as war score. I'm not even sure how this happened. It might be a bug. It might be because they declared war on me that I ended up having like a reduced cost to war score for provinces. But even then, it doesn't seem to make that much sense. I'm not sure. This part gets a little bit funny where we have Castile discovering the New World in 1398, you know, roughly a whole century before it happens in our timeline. And if it only happened once, it would be funny, but this is actually the second time that it happened. In my Norway playthrough, they actually did the exact same thing. Now, if I really wanted to, if I felt so inclined in my Norway playthrough, I could have just sent an expedition from Greenland. You can totally do that. But in this case, it's kind of funny that, you know, if it happens once, it's like, oh, that's unique, but that's fine. Because like, okay, they discover the New World 100 years ahead of time. It's not like they have the tech to really do anything with that. So, okay, who cares? It's interesting, you know, it's historical variety. But then it happens twice. And I'm thinking like, maybe this isn't supposed to happen. Maybe that needs a little bit of tweaking. Anyway, we go over to our religion in this case. The only thing we can really do from what I can tell is try to canonize saints when you're playing a Catholic country. I tried checking out the international organization, which we have down here. It does have a couple of mechanics, and it does allow you to vote on some things if you have cardinals. But I think you're only allowed to vote on things during the Council of Trent. And as I'm sure many of you know, the Council of Trent is not happening for like at least another 100 years. So it's interesting. I guess in the early game there isn't too much to do with Catholicism at the moment. I don't know if that's going to change, but anyway, we have the Reform Desire. I'm sure you can understand what that means, kind of similar to EU4's Reform Desire for Catholicism. And then we have the Religious Influence. Presumably, you will be able to spend this on other things things. Right now, I've just found that you canonize saints. That's what you do with it. And that's kind of it. Maybe there's something else that I missed. Maybe in someone else's video, they found the secrets. They unlocked the secret Pope cabinet option. I don't know. But if you're playing a Catholic country and not the Pope, this is kind of the extent of what you do. Okay, so I say at this point that there's really no way to build CBs in the early game, which is kind of true, but also kind of not true. As I've previously mentioned, it depends on the focus you go with. If I were playing diplomatic focus, I would actually be able to build CBs. If this country were a different religion, then even with my current focus, I would, in fact, be able to build a CB. And if I were just patient enough to wait for my parliament to come back, then I actually could have gotten a CB. So I was just kind of being annoyed at not having a CB. I could have just waited. No real reason to go to war at that point. I end up deciding to change my royal court customs away from aristocratic court over to the court of culture. The reason for this is, I accidentally hid it in the footage, but I think this is an increased monthly cultural influence, and it also gives you an increased skill for new artists, and it gives your artists a higher chance of actually starting on an art project. And so all of those things combined sort of work together towards increasing your cultural influence. We talked earlier about how this impacts a whole bunch of things, like your ability to assimilate or culturally convert some areas. It also, in fact, affects a bunch of other things. And one of those things, interestingly enough, is siege speed. If you have a higher cultural influence than the culture of a location that you are sieging, then it actually reduces the timer length for each siege tech, which is really interesting. But it means that there is a reason to invest in culture. You want to have high cultural influence, and you want to have high cultural tradition. I might have misspoken, actually. It's if you have a higher cultural influence than I believe the cultural tradition of the area that you're sieging. I think that's what it is. Cultural influence, I believe, is your offensive stat, and cultural tradition is your defensive stat. At this point, I have enough money that I can just comfortably begin to expand my road network. Earlier, I couldn't do this because I actually, funny enough, didn't have enough sand, which sounds like a weird thing to say. Like, what do you mean you don't have enough sand? But that's the truth. We didn't have enough sand in the market. We had like one location that was dedicated to sand RGOs. It wasn't enough for what we needed, so I ended up building like 20 sand pits, which are buildings that can give you sand. It's like if you don't have sand RGOs, it seems reasonable that you can just get sand anyway. Like, it's not like sand is restricted to 7 places on Earth. So there is a way for you to get additional sand just building different buildings. Same thing with stone. Stone is pretty much everywhere. So even if there isn't a dedicated RGO spot, you can still get it through having quarries, I think they're called. Also, same thing with clay and I think lumber. So you can build like sawmills, that gives you lumber, and clay pits can give you clay. So you don't need to have a specific RGO for everything. It's more useful if you do in a lot of cases, but if you happen to not have one, it's not the end of the world. At least for the most important ones. But yeah, I decided to expand the road network because roads are really expensive. But as we now have enough money from trade to do that, and we have enough materials to do that, expanding the road network is incredibly useful. The more you do that, of course, the more your proximity propagates throughout your territories, which means, of course, the more control you get, which also means the more crown power you get, the more taxes you get, the more appealing your market seems to that location, the more manpower, the more sailors. We went over this a little bit ago. Similarly, I started building these cathedrals. There are 2 versions, which I think are from Renaissance. So there are the grand cathedrals, which are for cities and towns, and then there are the rural cathedrals, which are for these settlements, which I think are like these ones over here. Now, they do functionally kind of the same thing. In fact, they cost the same amount, but they just have different locations, and I think they have very small differences between one another. But the thing that matters, the reason why you want to have them, is because they give you a flat 5% maximum control increase. And so, I technically really did not have to build one in the capital, nor did I have to build one here or here, and I don't think I had to build one here either. These are all going to be areas that I will have 100 or nearly 100 control in, so I didn't really need to build these, if I'm being honest. But, you're not just going to have grand cathedrals and not build the grand cathedral in the capital, of course. Naturally, you need to have one for the capital, if for no reason other than roleplay. gameplay. For a split second, actually, because I don't show this in the rest of the video, I don't think, I've been building a disgusting amount of irrigation. In fact, by the end of the video, I have maxed out the irrigation in every single province that is capable of doing so. As I mentioned, each level of irrigation gives you plus 5% food production. It also gives you, I think it's a flat plus 1,000 maximum population. So if you remember earlier, I was talking about settlements being available in locations that have less than 5% of their maximum population. One of the ways that you can increase the maximum population is through irrigation. So if there's a location that has like 8 levels of irrigation, that's plus 8,000 maximum population and plus 40% food production. And as you remember, we've been having issues with food for the entire campaign, and so building a ton of irrigation, literally maximizing it, became a necessity. When we get to this event, we have two options: either reducing the burgher estate satisfaction by 20%, which is kind of hefty. It's completely taken up by the title here, but if you reduce the satisfaction of your estates too low and they remain too low for too long, they can also actually rise up as a rebellion. And so that can become an issue if you neglect the estates for too long. What I end up doing with this one actually is I end up skipping too far ahead in the video, but then I also go ahead and pay 1,380 gold, which puts me into debt. The reason I kept this in is because I wanted to talk about the debt in EU5, because debt is far, far more penalizing in EU5. EU4, the default interest rate is, I don't remember if it's yearly or 5 yearly. I'm pretty sure it's yearly, and it's 4%, right? But in EU5, that's 10%. Very expensive loan. And so when you take out loans in the early game, this is not EU4 where you're like, oh, I'm going to take out loans and it's going to be fine. The interest is far more aggressive at the start of EU5. That's a key difference. In EU4, there's no technology that reduces your interest. There are ideas, I know. But in EU5, the whole plan here is you start with really high interest, you end up doing research, and it reduces your interest throughout the game. So eventually you will get to a point where you think like, actually, it's fine if I take out these loans because I can invest that into buildings that will make me more money than I have to pay in interest. So early game, you are not doing deficit spending in EU5. I'm hoping that by late game, we could deficit spend in EU5. That would be very interesting, but we have yet to see. Oh, here we go, actually. We can see that our current yearly interest is 7.21%. So there must be something, maybe it's the estate satisfaction. There must be something that I gave to the burghers to reduce that. It does have a default 10%, and yes, that is yearly, and it is for 5 years. We can also see how much money we can borrow from the estates, and I think the amount that you can borrow is a function of your tax base, as you can see here. I'm not sure exactly what the formula for that is, but the higher you increase your tax base, the higher you can raise your maximum loan capacity. You might also notice that down here it says we can ask for a loan from a banking country. I will briefly discuss banking countries because I didn't interact with them too much, but they're interesting because whenever I've taken out a loan, it's always been bought out by a banking country. And so the interesting thing is, like, if I take out a loan from an estate, I can expect that that loan is going to be bought by a banking country because they are, pun intended, banking on the fact that we're not going to pay that loan back so that the banking country can keep on making money off of that interest. It's really interesting. Now, banking countries can also own buildings. In fact, that's kind of how they exist, is they set up banks in locations. And so at this point in time, there actually is a banking country in the city of Napoli. They own a bank in that city. Unfortunately, I don't remember what it does. I kind of glossed over it when I looked at it. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. There's a banking country in my country. And then I didn't even look at it. So I apologize for not being as thorough as I should have been, but hopefully if I do get my hands on the game eventually in the next, I would hope next year or so, then I definitely want to take a look at the other forms of countries. If you didn't know, other than banking countries, we also have army-based countries. So we have like holy orders that I noticed a lot of when I was playing Portugal. So I know that there are like 2 that pop up in Castile, I think. Trade leagues are also building-based countries. Banking countries and trade leagues are just different forms of building-based countries. And what's also interesting interesting, actually. I don't get to show this off in this video because it happened in a different campaign, but I saw actually that the Hanseatic League, which is a building-based country, had a vassal. So even if they don't own territories, they can kind of own territories, just not directly. I thought that was interesting. So presumably, banking countries can probably hire armies as well, private armies, and they can probably enforce vassalage of different areas, which is kind of cool, actually. It really makes me want to play as a banking country, or as a trade league, you know. And then I think lastly, the other non-location-based countries are the Societies of Pops, which I don't think are playable. I'm not sure. I didn't check. Those are the countries that I was referring to earlier when I was playing as that tribe in North America, where you have these Societies of Pops. They are like groups of people, or like they're like a culture group in an area that isn't a settled down country, but does have a loose association between all these provinces. So they can do research and they can settle down, and when they settle down, they become location-based countries. It's kind of interesting. That might change, so take that with a grain of salt. I don't know what the long-term plan with that is, but I thought that was kind of neat. This is also interesting. I kept it in here because I thought it would be a discussion starter in the comments. Like, hey, we got a gift from somebody, now we owe them 5 favors, which is a little uncomfortable because it's like forced favors. Maybe I don't actually want to owe them 5 favors. Maybe we should be allowed to say, hey, thank you, but I don't want the gift because it comes with strings attached, right? The other thing is, in hindsight, I guess I'll talk more about this in the Greenland video, but this could be used for some interesting things depending on how it functions. I've also found that the war or the battle outcome indicator is maybe not the most accurate. I've had situations in the past where there's a battle that I'm obviously going to lose and it tells me that I'm going to win it, and then I go into that battle and get crushed, and like I knew what the outcome was going to be, but I thought maybe I was wrong because I haven't played enough of the game. So I'm like, okay, maybe there's something going on I'm not seeing. No, like it's just maybe not the most accurate sometimes. So for example, we look at this and we're like, oh, it says we're likely to lose, and then like we absolutely crushed them. I don't even get to show that. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. We can see that we just utterly annihilate them. It's not even close. So I'm not exactly sure why that is. I don't know. Almost forgot about these. I did mention earlier that you can build buildings to increase your crown power, and so here we have counting houses. They increase the crown power in a given location. If you remember earlier, when you don't have very much control, it reduces the amount of crown power you receive from a location. So this can be used to just bolster the amount of crown power you receive from a location. I don't exactly know what influences how much is your crown power in a given location, but I do know that you want to build a lot of these. They're not incredibly expensive. You can build quite a few in many different locations, as long as those are a town or a city. And then we have the Age of Discovery. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to explain colonization as far as I remember it, because we didn't really get to actually do that in this, but I might as well also explain that. So as we go back here, we can see that we have our options for exploring. We did get to show that off. You get your explorer, you assign them, they prepare their expedition, they go out, they explore, and then they come back. Or sometimes they die and you have to replace them in the middle of an expedition. Either way, once there is a location explored, or you're playing in Scandinavia, I guess, you can go ahead and start colonizing by going over to here, this colony tab. You click on this, and it's going to give you all of the possible options for you to colonize. So if it's within your colonial range, it's going to show up underneath this tab. Now, what ended up happening is I did actually discover the Canaries. There was nobody, it's not like there was nobody there. It had a native inhabitant population, but Castile had not gotten to it yet. So I was thinking, okay, I might as well do it myself then. But I didn't actually have the colonial range. See, I couldn't figure out how much I would have needed. I tried looking through colonial range maps and stuff like that, and maybe I'm too dense, but I literally couldn't find it. But in the end, I was not able to colonize the Canary Islands. We can see a few things though. For example, we have reduced cost of colonies. I don't actually remember what that's from. We do have our colonial migration, plus 50 per month, which is kind of important. See, once you send out a colony or establish a colony, it doesn't actually immediately create one. You start sending people over to a region, and once there are enough people in that region, then the location flips to you. And I think in order for that to work, I think what you have to do is either outnumber the number of people in that location with people of your own culture, or the culture that you're colonizing from, or you have to reach 1,000 settlers, and I actually don't remember which one it is. You might just have to send 1,000 settlers and then it's done. That could be it. Or maybe it's both. You need to have over 1,000 settlers, and maybe you need to outnumber the native inhabitants of that area for it to flip to you. That could be it. Either way, it does typically take a while, and it is usually rather expensive. And of course, this isn't EU4, so when you move people, you're moving people, like actual population of people away from your country to the colonies. And those colonies are typically not going to have a lot of control. You're probably going to have to release a colonial subject, which the game will prompt you to do once you're done colonizing a province. So if we had colonized the Canaries, for example, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think this is 7 locations within this province in the Canaries. I think these are all separate locations. And so you would have to send 1,000 people to each of these locations. And one by one, those locations would flip to you. And then once it's done, you get the option to either keep it, release it as a colonial subject and play as it, or release it as a colonial subject and keep that colonial subject. As we can see up here, what Castile ended up doing was releasing them as a colonial subject and keeping them, of course. That is probably the way you're going to want to set up colonies, especially as those colonies are further and further away from your home country. So it creates a natural reason to create colonial nations, even if you technically don't have to. Like, you have the choice of direct rule from your capital. Whether or not that's going to be effective is a different story. But that's how colonies function on at least a basic level, from my experience with them. I have yet to create a colonial nation because I never had any instance where I felt like that would be useful. Not even playing as Portugal, I decided to colonize the Azores. I think that's how it's pronounced. And even then, I just decided to keep them. But yeah, after all of that yapping, that is everything we have to discuss in this video. I might have missed something, or if you had like a question about something that you didn't end up asking in time, and I didn't address it in the video, then that's unfortunate. But at this point, I am going to go and look at some of the comments and see if I can answer some of those questions. A lot of people wanted my opinion on the UI, so I might as well give that as well. I actually don't hate the UI. I've seen a lot of people give their opinions on the UI, and I've seen a lot of people say that they really don't like it. Personally, I'm kind of fine with it, except for one thing that does really bug me. So I kind of don't like that this portrait is up here in the top left. I just don't like it. That's my main complaint, because sometimes I'll click on my country's flag, and it's not my country's flag. I've just accidentally clicked slightly too much to the left. And then I open up this menu, and I don't care about that menu. Like, I don't use it. And also, personally, I just don't want it to be there. I don't know. I'm a big fan of having the big flag in the top left. Huge fan of that. I love that. It is itself a button. This being next to the flag and a menu that I don't like to use and also a button, not a fan of that. Other than that, I actually really like a lot of the UI elements, especially the interconnectivity of so many of the different elements, which is to say that if you're clicking on one element of the UI that is completely different from one that you're trying to get to, but like it has a connected element, as in like, oh, you want to get to your market to figure out how much wheat you have, you can just click on wheat in a different place to open up that menu. Like, that's kind of cool. Also, I really like the search functionality, especially for buildings. I was concerned when I saw how many buildings there are in this game, but fortunately you can search up whatever you need. So like, you want to increase your literacy, you type in literacy into the search bar and it shows you everything that can increase literacy. That's pretty cool. Another thing that's pretty cool is if you want to build a bunch of the same building and you don't want to like click on a bunch of individual locations, what you can do is actually zoom out, so scroll out on the map and just click on your market and it will start building wherever it's available. I don't know how it prioritizes that. Maybe it prioritizes it based on how you've sorted the list of buildings or available spots to build that building. I don't quite remember, but it's pretty cool because it means you don't have to like manually click on every single location you want to build a thing in. You can just zoom out and generally spam left click until you've built whatever you need to build. Cool. As for the other parts, I'm not a huge fan of where the release subject button is. Here we go. That did take a little minute, but we have our 3 options. This is where you find it. It is not super intuitive. On the left side, you have the ability to release countries as like locations. So if you want to release a location or a province as a subject country, but there are no cores there, then that's fine, because we essentially have EU4's client state system, where you can just create a subject out of that territory, which I really appreciate because of how important subjects are in this game. In the middle, we have release countries as subjects. So this is your classic release a country as a subject in EU4. If there's a core there, it receives that core, it becomes a subject. Pretty useful. And then this one I think has to do with colonial nations. I'm pretty sure. But I don't think I ever got an opportunity to use this button, so I'm not super sure about that. Also, I do have to say that I haven't really found myself ever using these buttons here either. Because, I mean, at least for me, maybe it's because I didn't really ever take the time to learn what each of the icons are associated with. Obviously, you can hover over them, and you can probably guess a few of them. But whenever I want to do a diplomatic action, I've always just clicked the Open All Diplomatic Actions button, because at least then I know exactly what I'm looking for and where it is. So, I don't know, maybe this could be reworked a little bit, possibly. Generally, the look of the UI I'm kind of fine with. I don't really have any issues with that. I'm a big fan that we managed to keep the extra little pop-ups at the top. I really like that, especially over some of the other recent Paradox games that have like the little situation bubble. I'm looking at you, CK3. I don't really like that. I'm sure if I spent more time really thinking about it, I could find more issues with the UI, but it wasn't really one of the things that I was hyper-focused on while I was playing. Like, I didn't really think so much about it because the practicality of the UI is sufficient to me. The way that it looks is not really that important. For me, it's the practicality. You could literally give me a spreadsheet with the buttons, and I would play the game just fine. I don't really care too much. Now, another person asks, can you automate specific armies while controlling others like in Imperator? And the answer to that is yes. So I don't think I ever showed it off in this. Well, maybe I did. If I did show the piracy or the anti-piracy mechanics, then that's great. But essentially, when you go over to the little war general military button here, this tab, there is, you have your land and you have your naval tab. And for each of those, you can assign objectives, or you create objectives, and then you can assign armies or navies to those objectives. So yeah, if you want to have an army that's like patrolling a border, then you create an objective to patrol a border, and then you can assign an army to that. Another person asks, can you customize subjects as in culture, territory, and religion when creating and switching to them? You cannot fully customize your subjects, I don't think. In my experience releasing territories as subjects, I think they create like a random... I think the name is based on the location, the flag might be somewhat random. Semi-random as in it's going to pick something from a list of a regional variant, probably. The culture is going to be wherever you created it from. The territory can be expanded upon, but I'm not sure if you can switch to the subject after expanding that territory. I don't quite remember. And then in terms of religion, it's going to draw upon that location for religion, I think. But it's just the same as in like EU4, you can enforce religion on your subjects. But I think, for example, if you're playing like Naples and you conquer Egypt and you're going to want to create a subject in Egypt, then you're going to create I think it's a Sunni Egyptian subject. I think that's the situation going on in Egypt at that point. So you won't be able to customize it, I don't think. Someone asks, how's the game looking to me? Because of course, yeah, like I'm the guy who's played 109 hours in the game, so what do I think of it? I guess this would be a really good ending question then, right? So because I've only played so much of the early game, I can't say that I have the most formed opinion on it yet. I definitely need to play more of like I want to know how colonialism works. I want to know how the game manages to encourage you in the direction of like expanding overseas. Like if you're playing England, like what encourages you to go ahead and decide to like, I don't know, invade India or something? Is there an actual drive for raw resources? And do you have to manually expand, or is it the kind of thing where you can say okay for a private venture to go ahead and set up like, you know, trade offices and to start buying stuff and selling them? Like, how does that work exactly? How does it feel to progress through the game. From what I've experienced so far, I like what I've seen. I like what I played. I'm still a little bit, like, even despite playing 100 hours, I'm feeling a little bit cautiously optimistic, because as much as I have been enjoying the game, this is still the first 100 hours in a Paradox game. I don't understand how all the mechanics work yet. Like, I don't know enough to know if I agree with the way some things are implemented. So while the game has felt natural for me to pick up and learn over time, it feels like things have clicked into place, and it was surprisingly easy to pick up even without a tutorial, possibly because I play so much EU4. I've had a pretty positive experience with the game so far, and I think because of how receptive the development team is to feedback, both public and in private from us, I think that, in a way, what this game is going to end up being is going to be more like a collaboration between the developers and the community. So I have confidence in saying that we're going to end up with something that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy. Technically, this is an additional question, but someone asks, do I feel the game is fun without spending days studying it like a university lecture? And I would say yes, mostly because of the automation system, and possibly because of the tutorial. That depends on when that actually arrives. So I can't say that the tutorial is going to be particularly useful. I will be scrutinizing the tutorial when it comes out. I am a stickler about game tutorials, so I will be taking a careful critical eye at that. Now, that being said, because we didn't get a tutorial, we had to rely on just reading stuff. So we had to study it like a university lecture. But there were some things that made that easier, like the automation system. If the game can handle some aspects of itself for you, then you can focus on trying to understand specific parts. For me, for example, when I played Portugal, that was my very first run, I delegated pretty much the entire economy to the AI, to my country, or for the game to manage it for me. And I just kind of watched what it did. I tried to figure out, like, okay, so it started building marketplaces in these areas. Okay, it started building some bailiffs in these areas. Okay, so it's building this here, and this here. Why is that? What's useful about these buildings in those locations? And so I learned by example, by watching what the game did, to figure out some very, very basic mechanics. And then I tried to extrapolate, like, okay, if the game wants to build marketplaces a lot, then maybe I should focus on building marketplaces. So I tried that. I found that it makes you a lot of money, and I'm like, okay, so that's how that works then. It's going to be, I'd say, a similar, but hopefully not as painful learning experience as EU4. Especially if you got into EU4 years after it came out. As more and more features were added, it became a much more unapproachable game over time. But I think, at least in the launch phase, if the tutorial is done well, I think it's actually not going to be hard to pick up. That's my prediction. I think a lot of people are going to feel pleasantly surprised by how easy it is to get into the game. And I hope I don't eat my words on that, but that's what I'm feeling right now. That's where I'm at. So finally, I would like to thank everybody who wished me a late happy birthday on that video. And with that being said, I hope I answered enough questions. I know this video is ridiculously long at this point, but it is full of information that I hope was useful. I hope I answered plenty of questions that people had. If you have more, you can go ahead and drop them down below. I might be able to get to them. I can respond like in the comments, but we'll see. I can't get to all of them. And stay tuned, because remember, I'm still going to briefly go over the Greenland, the Norway, and the Scotland campaigns that I did. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton of footage to use for those, because whatever you've seen in that first video is all you're going to see. That's all I can show you. So it's gonna be interesting, but I'm gonna work on recalling every detail that I can remember from those campaigns. So look forward to those. But if you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate a like, subscribe for more EU5 content in the future, because I am really excited to play as much of this game as possible when it does release. But for now, this is Corbett signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day.